When we think of the Central Powers in World War I, almost all of the attention goes to Germany. It's easy to forget that another major empire was also fighting alongside them, Austria-Hungary. That is because while Germany was perhaps the most effective participant in the war, Austria-Hungary was one of the least. When acting on its own, it failed to achieve almost anything. Even when the war started and its troops were fresh, it was unable to defeat Serbia, which had a much smaller military. So why was Austria-Hungary so ineffective? Why couldn't the large and historic empire do more to help its German ally? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions, but first let's have an overview of how it happened, the story of Austria-Hungary in World War I. Before that, I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, Supremacy 1914. Supremacy 1914 is a real-time, free online strategy game where you choose a country to lead during World War I. You can fight up to 500 other players in real time in games that can take weeks to complete. You choose various different units to build your military, including cavalry, tanks, and planes. From there, you have to choose your strategy. Will you choose aggression and try to defeat your opponents on the battlefield, or will you forge alliances and achieve supremacy through diplomatic means? Supremacy 1914 can be played on both PC and mobile, allowing you to play both at home and on the go. New users can get an offer of 15,000 gold and a 1-month premium subscription for free by using the link in the description. In June of 1914, Europe was at peace and war didn't seem to be on the horizon. In fact, the continent was at the height of its power. The past century had been relatively peaceful, allowing for levels of prosperity and technological progress never before seen in human history. There were tensions between the nations, but they had just about been kept in check. Then, on the 28th of June, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. That act of terrorism would end up triggering an astonishing escalation into what would become the biggest war the world had ever seen. Germany and Austria-Hungary would find themselves fighting the combined forces of Britain, France, and Russia. For Austria-Hungary, the war got off to a very bad start. Their plan was to invade Serbia, knocking it out of the war quickly before Russia had a chance to join the fight. However, such a rapid advance was beyond the scope of the Austro-Hungarian military. Their army was outdated, poorly coordinated, and plagued by internal divisions due to the many ethnicities within the empire. Even though Serbia had a much smaller and weaker military, they were able to hold off the Austro-Hungarian invasion. Serbian forces put up stiff resistance, and the Austrians suffered numerous humiliating defeats in the opening months of the war. They did actually capture the Serbian capital in December of 1914, but they couldn't defend it and had to withdraw after a few days. Things also went badly in the fight against Russia in the east. Russian forces invaded the region of Galicia, part of modern-day Ukraine, and the Austro-Hungarians were unable to hold them off. The Russians advanced rapidly, capturing key Austro-Hungarian cities such as Lviv. By late September, after just 1 month of fighting, the Austro-Hungarian forces had suffered staggering losses, perhaps around 300,000 men, while inflicting only modest losses on the Russians. With Austria-Hungary losing territory fast, German troops had to be sent to stabilize the front line. That did work to stall the Russian advance, but it demoralized the Austro-Hungarian forces, demonstrating to them that they were the junior partner in the alliance. By the end of 1914, Austria-Hungary had lost not only large territories in the east, but also significant parts of its military strength. Around 1 million men had died in their campaigns against Serbia and Russia, both of which had failed to achieve their objectives. The next year, 1915, would see a mixture of setbacks and some successes, but overall the picture remained bad. In May, it launched the Galisitano offensive, an enormous attack with the Germans directed at the center of the front. The Galisitano offensive was meticulously planned and delivered a decisive blow to Russia. The Central Powers achieved an astonishingly rapid advance into Russian territory, capturing vast swathes of Eastern Europe and leading to Russian soldiers surrendering en masse. The offensive was a great success, with Austria losing about 1 million men, while Austria-Hungary lost only 200,000. That said, the success was largely due to German military strategy and much less to Austria-Hungary. Another significant victory came in November of 1915, when Serbia was finally overrun. It had taken over a year to achieve, and again it was only possible with significant German help. Still, with Serbia neutralized, Austria-Hungary was able to free up some of its resources to be used elsewhere. That was extremely fortunate, as in 1915, Italy entered the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy had actually been allied with the Central Powers before the war, but in 1915 it switched sides and joined the Allies. Austria-Hungary had never truly trusted Italy, and therefore it already had a plan to confront it. However, despite fighting numerous battles, Austria-Hungary failed to make any decisive gains and suffered enormous casualties. Against Italy, Germany wasn't willing to help, so Austria-Hungary was fighting alone. Luckily for them, the Italian army proved to be equally ill-prepared and ineffective, so the Italian front became simply a bloody stalemate. While it did drain Austria-Hungary's resources even further, it didn't result in any serious loss of territory or prestige. The victories in the east against Russia allowed for the Austro-Hungarian military to recover while preparing for the operations of 1916. Its war economy also improved, and the army went into the third year of the war with optimism and hope. However, that wasn't to last. In June, the Russians launched the most successful offensive of the whole war, the Brusilov offensive. That proved to be the worst crisis of the war for Austria-Hungary, and it would never truly recover. It began on June the 4th, 1916, with a massive surprise attack against the Austro-Hungarian forces on the Eastern Front. The Russian strategy involved well-coordinated attacks using artillery barrages to support waves of infantry. Within weeks, the Russian army had made significant gains, recapturing some of the territory lost the year before. The Austro-Hungarian army suffered huge casualties, perhaps as many as 500,000 men. The Brusilov offensive was a turning point. From then on, Austria-Hungary ceased to function as an independent military, and all operations were led by Germany. In November of 1916, the Emperor, Franz Joseph, died, which was a huge blow to morale. He had reigned for almost half a century and helped unite the many different ethnicities within the empire. His successor, Charles, didn't inspire the same confidence and proved to be unpopular with the troops. By 1917, Austria-Hungary was on the verge of collapse, with its military in chaos, its economy in ruins, and its people starving. Then, in November, the communist Bolsheviks took power in Russia, promising to pull it out of the war. That was a glimmer of hope for the Central Powers, as it meant that they could concentrate all their forces on the western and southern fronts. However, Austria-Hungary continued to struggle against Italy. They fought numerous battles along the Isonzo River, but took heavy casualties and gained little. They did actually have a big victory in November at the Battle of Caporetto, allowing them to advance 150 kilometers into Italian territory. However, they couldn't hold on to their gains and had to retreat soon afterwards. 1918 proved to be the final chapter for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By that point, years of conflicts had decimated the military, leading to a severe manpower shortage and a crisis of morale. The political landscape was equally dire, with growing calls for independence from various ethnic groups. The Italian front remained stagnant, and the Austro-Hungarian forces continued to suffer from inadequate supplies. The spring and summer of 1918 saw the Central Powers launching several offensives in a desperate bid to break the stalemate. In June, Austria-Hungary fought in the Battle of the Piave River, where they aimed to seize the initiative against the Italians. However, the offensive failed miserably, with heavy casualties on both sides. At that point, Germany was also facing extreme difficulties, including food shortages and rebellions inside the country. The final act of the war for Austria-Hungary was its defeat by the Italians at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto in November. 300,000 men were captured, forcing it to give up the important cities of Trento and Trieste. The war finally ended with an armistice on the 3rd of November. With that, the empire collapsed. So, that is what happened, the defeat of Austria-Hungary and the total collapse of the empire. Now I'd like to persuade you that Austria-Hungary really did perform badly, far worse than anyone was expecting. One of the best examples of Austria-Hungary's poor performance was their first encounter with Serbia, right at the start of the war. On paper, it shouldn't have been too difficult for them to defeat Serbia. They had 4 times as many infantry divisions, 48 to Serbia's 11. However, when the two sides met, it went disastrously for Austria-Hungary. They lost 1/3 of their infantry and half of their artillery. After only 8 days, they were forced to abandon the invasion and chaotically retreated back across the border. In total, they lost 28,000 men, almost twice as many as Serbia. Austria-Hungary did actually try another invasion 2 months later, but again they failed and had to withdraw, humiliated. While that failure was humiliating, the defeat in Galicia was a catastrophe. It was there that the empire had the bulk of its army, 1.2 million troops, most of its cavalry, and about 2,000 guns. The army was up against Russian forces that were a third larger and buckled under the pressure. After just 1 month, the Austro-Hungarian leadership ordered a general retreat. In theory, they were to regroup and form a new defensive line, but the Russians pursued aggressively and pushed them back much further than they had intended. That failed opening campaign nearly annihilated the Austro-Hungarian army, which lost more than a third of its strength, around 400,000 troops. The chaos of the retreat was further exacerbated by a cholera epidemic, and large numbers of men ended up dying in ditches along the roadside. Total collapse was only avoided thanks to the intervention of the Germans. Even towards the end of the war, Austria-Hungary was still far less effective than it should have been. For example, in 1918, Russia had pulled out of the war so they could focus entirely on the front against Italy. Italy was also one of the weakest participants in the war, but still Austria-Hungary struggled to secure a decisive victory. It wasn't until 1917 and only with German assistance that they managed to break through and advance into Italy. Even then, the commanders failed to take advantage and Italy had time to regroup and launch a counteroffensive. Those are just some of the examples where Austria-Hungary performed far worse than it should have. In the words of one German envoy, the Austro-Hungarian military was rotten and decayed. So, the question then is why? Why was Austria-Hungary so ineffective in the war? Well, one of the biggest reasons was that their empire was incredibly ethnically diverse. Here is a map of all the ethnicities in the empire. As you can see, there were a lot of them. That was a problem because many of those ethnic groups weren't very committed to the empire. Some of them actually wanted it to collapse. More than any other nation, Austria-Hungary lacked a sense of being one nation, of one people committed to the war effort. The Austrian leadership knew that that was a problem. In fact, in 1895, the Austrian Prime Minister acknowledged the empire's situation, stating to the German ambassador, "Any war is an impossibility for Austria. If we are attacked, we must accept the situation with God's help. A multinational state cannot fight a war without damage." The multi-ethnic nature of the empire was reflected in its military. Of every 100 soldiers in the army, there were 25 Germans, 23 Hungarians, 13 Czechs, 9 Serbs or Croats, 8 Poles, and a handful of Ruthenes, Romanians, Slovaks, Slovenes, and 1 Italian. As you can imagine, that was very counterproductive to the Austrian war effort, and one of the biggest problems that it caused was that all those ethnic groups spoke different languages. During the war, the Austro-Hungarian military was actually trying to operate in 10 different languages. As you can imagine, that did not work very well. In theory, the general command language was German, and the units were to operate in whatever languages were spoken by their men. In many cases, a single unit would have to operate in multiple languages. If at least 20% of a unit spoke a particular language, it became officially recognized within the regiment. That made it extremely difficult for soldiers to become officers when they didn't know at least 2 languages, and it proved catastrophic when there was an urgent need for new commanders. Those new officers had very little time to learn the languages, which, as you can imagine, resulted in utter chaos. Having to operate in multiple languages was far from the only issue with having such a multi-ethnic empire. Another was the fact that many of those ethnic groups weren't really committed to Austria-Hungary. Some of them even wanted the empire to be defeated so that they would be able to get independence. Nationalist sentiment had been a problem in the Austro-Hungarian military for decades. For example, Czech nationalists had long been encouraging soldiers to respond with the Czech "ze" during the register, instead of the German "Heer." Austrian generals had long suspected that their troops wouldn't be loyal, particularly if they were made to fight other Slavs, such as Russians or Serbs. When the war did finally break out, they were proven correct. The Czech regiments were particularly disobedient and had a high rate of desertion. For example, at the first battle with Serbia, they were the first to be routed by the Serbian advance. Later, in 1915, many regiments surrendered to the Russians without even fighting. Perhaps the best example was when some disaffected Czech regiments left the front wearing the Czech national colours in their caps and waving flags which said, "We are marching against the Russians and we do not know why." Another major problem with being so multi-ethnic was that the different parts of the empire had very different degrees of development and education. While parts of Austria and Hungary were as advanced as any region in Europe, vast areas, particularly in rural Galicia and Dalmatia, remained entrenched in near-medieval conditions. That meant that many recruits arrived for basic training illiterate and lacking basic skills necessary for military life. They were, in the words of one historian, utterly alien to the world of discipline, timetable, and hygiene. There was actually a joke that Galician peasants made the world's best troops, but first needed 3 years of training to become human and another 5 to become soldiers. So, the multi-ethnic nature of the army was a big problem for Austria-Hungary, but it was far from the only issue. In fact, the ethnic divisions might have been less of a problem if it weren't for the poor leadership at all levels of the military. At the top, the army's command structure was uniquely dysfunctional because it essentially served 2 separate governments. Austria and Hungary functioned as distinct states with their capitals in Vienna and Budapest, but under one monarch in Vienna. That arrangement led to something of a power struggle, with the Hungarians always pushing for more influence. The military became a battleground for that struggle. While there was one joint army, there was also 2 much smaller armies, Austria's Territory Army and Hungary's Home Defence Guard. While the Austrians saw the smaller forces as supplementary to the common army, the Hungarians viewed their defence guard as independent, existing only to defend Hungary. Budapest was therefore suspicious of any enlargement or strengthening of the main army, always pushing for more money to be spent on their home guard. That made coordinating resources and deployments nearly impossible, with catastrophic results once the war began. Those structural weaknesses were worsened by the incompetence of the leadership. A good example is a disastrous decision made by Field Marshal Franz Conrad right at the beginning of the war. In a slightly crazy plan, he deployed his best unit, the Second Army, to the Serbian front, but with the intention to withdraw it after 3 weeks and send it to the east to face the Russians. Conrad believed that that would be enough time to defeat Serbia and that Russia's vast army would be slow to mobilize. However, he was wrong on both counts. The Serbian army resisted fiercely and Russia mobilized much faster than anticipated. In the end, the maneuver cost a huge number of men and achieved nothing. To quote Winston Churchill, the Second Army left Potirek before it could win him a victory. It returned to Conrad to participate in his defeat. As you can see, the commanders were struggling with how to manage a 2-front war. Another good example was during the Brusilo offensive 2 years later. Conrad thought that the front against Russia was secure, so he redirected crucial resources to the front against Italy. However, he completely misjudged the situation in the east. The front wasn't secure, and Russia launched a huge offensive and took a lot of territory. One of the reasons that Austria-Hungary's leadership was so bad was actually because of the interference of Germany. For example, Austria-Hungary went on the offensive against Russia in 1914 because Germany told it to. In truth, it would have been better to adopt a defensive strategy. That gamble was beyond the scope of Austria-Hungary and led to enormous losses. Even though Austria-Hungary had done what Germany told them to, they were treated with contempt and sidelined in key strategic decisions. For example, during the Galicia-Tarnów offensive in 1915, the Germans launched the operation without consulting the Austrians, despite the fact that much of the fighting was going to take place on Austro-Hungarian soil. Another great example was at the end of the war, when Germany demanded that Austria-Hungary attack Italy, even though it knew that it wouldn't be successful. Germany was effectively sacrificing Austria-Hungary to give itself a slightly better chance of winning the war. With Austria-Hungary drained and demoralized, it reluctantly complied. By that point, it was essentially just following German orders with no ability to function independently. While leadership at the highest level was extremely poor, the lower levels were no better. A good example comes from the fight against Serbia at the beginning of the war. The invading Austrian army had to march through rough, mountainous terrain that hindered logistics and favored the defenders. The Austrian officers were seemingly oblivious to that and kept launching reckless attacks without adequate planning or reconnaissance. Most of the soldiers sent barely had any training and were entering combat with insufficient ammunition or artillery support. When the soldiers performed badly, the officers actually blamed them, particularly those of ethnic minority groups, such as the Czechs. For example, after the initial defeat against the Serbs, the officers accused the Czech troops of cowardice and disloyalty, further demoralizing them. One of the reasons that the officers were so bad is that many of them were totally unqualified to have their positions. That was because Austria-Hungary lost an astonishing 80% of its officers in the first year of the war, and so they had to be quickly replaced by unsuitable men. In the words of one German commander, many of Austria-Hungary's officers were not suitable for a military career. Overall, Austrian command was extremely poor throughout the war. From top to bottom, they were overconfident, indecisive, and slow to learn. Another major problem for the Austro-Hungarian military was that it faced a severe shortage of money, manpower, and equipment. They spent far less on defense than any other major European power, less than a third of what other European powers were spending. Even Italy spent more. That underfunding reduced conscription, which left the empire lagging behind other nations in terms of manpower. Each year, only around 130,000 new recruits joined the military, despite the empire's population of 52 million. Even then, many conscripts had to be discharged a year early due to financial constraints. That meant that although Austria-Hungary's population grew by over 20% from 1890 to 1910, the number of troops remained the same. The Austro-Hungarian army also faced severe shortages in basic equipment for its soldiers. By 1918, the army could barely supply each soldier with more than a single pair of shoes. On the freezing Alpine front, many soldiers had to fight in inadequate or worn-out footwear. Food supplies were similarly dire, with some frontline soldiers weighing as little as 55 kilograms. The men had to survive on meager rations of cornbread, boiled vegetables, and just 200 grams of meat per week. Clothing and equipment were equally scarce, with soldiers often unable to replace their tattered uniforms. Essential items like decent boots or underwear became luxuries. The situation was equally bad when it came to weaponry, particularly artillery. Many of Austria-Hungary's guns were extremely outdated and vastly inferior to Russian artillery. They did have one modern artillery piece, but only had 24 of them because of budget limitations. An even bigger problem was the lack of ammunition. In the words of Conrad, the Chief of Staff, the present condition of our army already has an appearance of permanent limitation of armament. For example, in December of 1914, they produced only 116,000 shells, about 10% of the 1 million that they needed per month. Divisions had to ration their munitions to avoid being left with nothing. Things did get better as the war went on, but they still lagged far behind the other powers. In 1916, artillery shell production reached just under 1 million per month, while Germany was producing 7 million and Russia was producing 4 million. Austria-Hungary also lagged behind in producing heavy guns, mortars, and even basic supplies like barbed wire. Rifle production plummeted from 100,000 units per month in early 1917 to fewer than 10,000 by February of 1918. The army became increasingly reliant on Germany for essential resources. By mid-1916, half the helmets used by Austria-Hungary came from Germany, as did much of the cloth for new uniforms. The situation was also very bad when it came to another key technological innovation of the war, aeroplanes. Austria-Hungary did have an air force, but like the rest of its military, it suffered from a lack of resources. Here is a chart showing aircraft production by the major powers during the war. As you can see, Austria-Hungary was the second worst, only slightly better than Russia. Perhaps the most glaring example of Austria-Hungary's lack of equipment was that it never produced a single tank. Instead, they continued to use cavalry, even though machine guns and artillery had rendered it nearly obsolete. When they faced tanks themselves while fighting in Italy, they struggled to find a way to combat them. They produced very few anti-tank weapons and had to resort to passive measures like digging tank traps and ditches. Overall, Austria-Hungary didn't produce anywhere near enough equipment during the war. One of the biggest reasons for that is that they had a severe shortage of raw materials. A good example is copper. Before the war, the empire produced only around 10% of the copper that it needed. The rest was imported. However, once the war began, supply lines were disrupted and imports collapsed. By 1917, Austria-Hungary was getting only a third of the copper that it needed. In desperation, the authorities seized copper from breweries, electrical suppliers, and even melted down church bells. Copper wasn't the only material in short supply. There was also a lack of steel. That was in large part because steel workers weren't exempt from conscription. They were sent to the front. In 1914, about a third of steel workers were drafted into the army, leading to a 70% drop in production. While output did recover somewhat in 1915, the damage had been done and many factories had closed. By 1917, Austria-Hungary was relying heavily on steel imports from Germany and Sweden. A big part of the reason that production was so bad was because the railway system was overwhelmed. Again, that was in part because a lot of the railway workers had been sent to the front. It was also because thousands of freight cars had been lost in early battles, and the lack of steel made it impossible to replace them. Even for the trains that were functional, there wasn't enough coal to run them. By 1918, the rail system was nearing collapse. It was just one of many examples of the empire's total disintegration. One final reason for Austria-Hungary's poor performance in the war was the social unrest in the population. Civilian unrest grew as shortages made life unlivable and people lost the will to fight the war. In January of 1918, anti-war strikes broke out, driven by hunger and poor living conditions. In cities like Vienna and Prague, workers protested for better rations and pay, and those strikes began to expose deep cracks between the ruling elite and the people. Eventually, that civilian unrest spread to the military. On February 1st, 1918, a mutiny broke out at the Cattaro naval base in modern-day Montenegro. Desertions soon followed, with 100,000 soldiers abandoning their posts by the summer. Many of those deserters formed armed bands known as Green Cadres that roamed the forests and exacerbated the empire's internal collapse. The reason that there was so much social unrest was because life for the civilian population was unbearable. By mid-1918, the entire empire was in a profound economic crisis with barely enough food to feed the population. Before the war, Austria-Hungary had been largely self-sufficient in food, but by 1916, even wealthy Austrians were relying on German food aid. That was due to the Russian invasion of the East in 1914, which had devastated key agricultural regions. Those regions had once supplied a third of Austria's meat and nearly half of its wheat and potatoes. By the end of the war, Vienna's war kitchens fed over 150,000 people daily, about one-fifth of the city's population. The social unrest was pivotal in the eventual disintegration of the empire and its military. Nationalist movements surged, and the different ethnic groups saw their chance for independence. By October of 1918, several national councils had declared independence, and the imperial government was powerless to stop them. The collapse of the empire is best summed up by a quote from the Chief of Staff of the military. The Empress, Zita of Bourbon-Parma, asked him how many troops could protect the emperor. He replied simply, "Not a single battalion, Your Majesty."